Jimmy Clark crosses the finish line to become the victor of the 1965 Indianapolis 500.
He was one of the fastest drivers in any car, no matter what it was. From Formula One to touring cars to the Indy 500 and beyond, Jim Clark was the original smooth operator of racing, driving faster and harder than anyone before or since, with a supernatural ability to prevent wear on the car and find speed where nobody else could. Still holding records some 60 years later, Jim Clark is held aloft alongside greats like Ayrton Senna and Juan Manuel Fangio. But why? Why is Jim Clark held in such high regard? And why did his racing career nearly end before it had begun?
I don't think that any of the modern drivers could have driven the car anywhere near as quickly as Jimmy did.
The story of James Jim Clark began in Fife, Scotland, the youngest of 5 and the sole boy in a traditional farming household. Clark would frequent a local farmers' meeting, getting his kicks driving the rural roads between the farm and the meeting hall. One such night, Clark happened across another traveller. Showing signs of his early promise, Clark flashed past the driver and off into the distance. Hell-bent on having a few choice words for the young Clark was a man named Ian Scott Watson. The two would strike up a bond at that meeting, a mutual love of cars bringing them together. Ian Watson raced in local events and invited Clark to see him in action. Few could predict the outcome of this invitation. After one such run, Clark asked if he could experience the car, and like most, Ian Watson saw little harm in letting Clark try it out. Despite never driving the car or the circuit before, lapped 3 seconds quicker than the experienced Watson. When Clark got out of the car, he would ask his new friend Watson, why was everyone going so slowly? Watson, who still could not believe what he had just seen, explained to Clark that the others were not going slow, he was just going so bloody fast. Thus began Jim Clark's journey from an unknown farm boy to local racing legend. By 1958, Clark was starting to grab victory after victory in road races and hill climb events, leading to Boxing Day 1958, where he would line up next to Colin Chapman. Clark would finish second that day, beaten by Chapman, but Colin saw something special in Jim, something you could not teach a driver, something a driver needed to have from birth. Clark would go on to drive for Colin Chapman's Lotus several more times, including a Le Mans and several more hill climb events. Impressive at every event he raced, Chapman would hand Clark a seat in Formula Junior, a new competition formed in 1958 as a stepping stone to the big leagues. No points for guessing the outcome here. Despite racing against John Surtees and Trevor Taylor, Jim Clark would win, beginning a fairy tale romance between Clark and the Lotus team, a team he would stay with throughout his career until 1968. Clark would receive a baptism of fire in his first Formula One outing. With Lotus driver John Surtees heading off to race the Isle of Man TT, Chapman took Clark to the Dutch Grand Prix as the team's third driver. Clark would retire on lap 42 with gearbox issues, a less than stellar start to his F1 career, and things were about to get worse. The 1960 Grand Prix at Spa is one of the worst days in the sport's long history. A fast and dangerous track, even more so than the one used today, awaited Clark and his fellow drivers. In the practice session, Sterling Moss would crash and receive extensive injuries. Mike Taylor would also crash in the same session. His injuries, however, would end his racing career, and the race itself would only get worse. Chris Bristow would crash and suffer a gruesome end, alongside Alan Stacey, Clark's Lotus teammate, who would be struck by a bird and crash at full throttle, dying instantly. Clark, in an interview in 1964, would say about the Belgian Grand Prix, "I was scared stiff by the whole race. I was afraid to let the car slide and drift. A terrible race. It was a terrible day for the sport, and those who loved it. More drivers had paid the ultimate price in the deadly game of speed and bravery." Despite those horrific events, Clark would finish 5th, scoring his first Formula One points. He would go on to forever hate Spa. With the passing of Alan Stacey, Clark would drive again for Lotus and finish out the 1960 season, picking up more points and his first podium at the Portuguese Grand Prix. However, more heartache would follow Clark in 1961. During that year's Grand Prix at Monza, Clark would batter the Ferrari of championship hopeful Wolfgang von Trips. The pair would touch wheels, resulting in Wolfgang flying off the course near a busy spectator section. He would sadly die that day alongside 15 spectators. It would be a dark and difficult year for Clark, hounded by the local press, and being accused of manslaughter by the Italian press nearly made Clark walk away from the sport altogether. Thankfully for Clark, things would improve drastically in 1962. An improved Lotus would allow Clark to compete with the dominant Ferraris of the time. Its speed and lightweight design made it a serious contender even until the final race of the season, but it was far from reliable, letting Clark down on numerous occasions, often when he was leading the race. This outcome, however, would not be repeated.
In Barcelona in practice, he came in after 10 laps and we were doing 10. He said, "There's something on the left rear. Something is, I can feel something on the left rear. It's not right." We looked over, we checked everything. Everything felt good. We said, "No, there's something wrong." So that night, I took the left rear suspension to pieces, and lo and behold, one of the wheel bearings has just started to wear. I don't know how anybody could ever feel that, but he did.
1963 saw Lotus work on their issues, giving Clark a reliable car to challenge for the title, and challenge he did. Clark would go on to win 7 races, including Silverstone, Monza, and the dreaded Spa circuit. His 7th win set a record that would only be equalled some 20 years later by Alain Prost, driving the McLaren MP4-2, and beaten only in 1988 by Ayrton Senna and the McLaren MP4-4. Considering the 1963 Formula One World Championship had only 10 races, and both the 1984 and 1988 had 16, Clark's 70% win ratio is much better than either McLaren driver, showcasing Clark's ability when compared to some of the greatest drivers to ever grace the sport. To have a real understanding of Clark's skill, however, look no further than his old nemesis, Spa. Unusually, Clark struggled and only qualified in the middle of the field, but in heavy rain, he would carve his way to the front on race day, with numerous drivers suffering mechanical breakdowns. Clark too would have a gearbox issue, one that could only be solved by holding the selector in place, a death-defying move for any driver in normal conditions. But Spa in 1963 was like a bathtub. It was like driving around a water slide at 160 miles an hour. You see, today's drivers struggle with the wet, despite their space-age tyre technology. But Jim Clark was no ordinary driver. Despite the track looking like a swimming pool, Clark would grasp the steering wheel firm with one hand and his gear selector with another. Driving at such immense speeds in the wet and losing 5th gear shortly after, Clark would smash his Lotus over the line with only 4 gears remaining. It was P1 for Clark that day, having lapped every other driver on the track, bar Bruce McLaren, who only managed to get within 4 minutes and 54 seconds of Clark, and Clark was far from finished. Off the racetrack, Clark was a very different personality than most would expect from a world champion. Described as shy and introverted by those that worked with him, the Jim Clark outside the car was maybe the exact opposite of the Jim Clark inside it. One thing that followed Clark wherever he went was his conscience. Jim Clark was a gentleman, an upstanding guy. He did not believe in some of the cutthroat racing some other greats were known for. Clark raced his race. If you beat him, you were the better man that day, and he would shake your hand and admit that. But the world very nearly did not get to see Jim in this light. When he was 16, studying away from home in Edinburgh, Jim would get the news that both his uncle and grandfather had passed. Being the sole boy in the family, tradition dictated Clark would pick up the mantle at the family farm. If it was not for that meeting with Ian Scott Watson, Jim Clark probably would have stayed on the farm his entire life. Clark was also not a big believer in his own ability. Much like Fangio, it was the passion of outsiders that pushed Clark towards racing. It took all the effort by Watson and other friends to convince Clark to take part, as would be the case more often than not, for Clark was ever reluctant to believe in his own talent. And this is what makes Clark so lovable. He was an everyman. He wasn't a flash playboy. He was a farm boy, a local lad, a countryside lover who enjoyed the simple things in life. His mechanic for those early Lotus years, Cedric Seltzer, remembers that upon meeting Clark, he thought that there was no way that he was a racing driver since he was so quiet and so shy. There was no real indication then of what Clark would go on to achieve in 1965. Before we get into the glory days, we need your help. We're on a mission to hit 15,000 subscribers before the end of this year. So if you've enjoyed this video so far, why not give it a like and subscribe to the channel and help us reach that goal together.
On opening day, Sam Hanks renews his friendship with the race car, in which both he and Jimmy Bryant won the 500 in successive years.
1965 would go down in history as a record nobody has been able to beat since. Jim Clark would start the season off racing the Tasman Series in Australia. Of the 13 races on the calendar, Clark would go on to win 11, cruising to the championship in a very demanding series like it was a Sunday drive to the local market. Clark would also compete in both the British and French Formula 2 championships. No points for guessing the outcome here. Clark won both, taking his tally to 3 championships in 1965. But there was more to come. The Indy 500 beckoned. Returning 2 years after his first outing, Clark looked to improve on his previous performance, and improve he would. Against the greatest oval racers of the time, this circuit racer would win. In an unfamiliar car, on an unfamiliar track, the margin of victory, you would assume, would be very tight. Clark, however, would win the Indy 500 not by a second, not by a minute, but by over 2 minutes from the next closest driver. Clark now had 4 titles in 1965 alone, but one more lay ahead, the biggest prize of them all, the 1965 Formula 1 World Championship. And Clark would start well, winning 4 of the opening 5 races, despite only competing in 4 of those due to his little trip to the Indy 500. Clark would go on to clinch the title convincingly. He would race 63 times in 1965, more than once a week, around the globe, at a time when drivers needed to race often just to earn a living, and death awaited many every time they sat behind the wheel. He would win 31 of those races and set a record that has never been beaten, even until this day. Jim Clark, in his 1965 season, is the only time a racing driver has won both the Formula 1 world title and the Indy 500 in the same season. This is made even more impressive, if that's possible, by Clark nursing a slipped disc through the beginning of 1965, an injury that would lay most of us out in bed at home, not Clark. Clark could drive the greatest season of any driver ever, even with a severe injury.
A lot of very good racing drivers died in Lotuses because the Lotus was a very fragile car. But Jim Clark was so smooth that he never put too much stress on the areas of a car that would give up.
Clark would continue to race in multiple series throughout his career. In 1968, Clark would enter a Formula 2 race in Hockenheim, Germany. In a rare occurrence, Clark would not win that day. In fact, it would be one of the biggest losses the world has ever seen. Like the twists of fate that brought Clark to racing after his chance meeting with Ian Scott Watson, fate had now twisted against him and us all. Jim was not meant to race that day, a contract obligation being the factor that brought the Scot to Germany on the 7th of April 1968. The cause is contested, but every driver believed Clark could not have been at fault. Such was his smoothness and the lack of error in his style. Many believe a slow puncture unsettled the car and caused the crash that would be heard around the world. Mourners would come from all over to Clark's funeral. Colin Chapman, the Lotus owner and longtime close friend of Clark's, was devastated and publicly stated that he had lost his best friend that day. At the time of his death, the 32-year-old Clark had achieved feats many have tried to surpass, but so few have managed. He had 33 pole positions and 25 race wins from his 72 Grand Prix starts in championship races. He had more Grand Prix wins with 25 and more pole positions with 33 than any other driver, including 5-time world champion Juan Manuel Fangio. Despite winning 3 less world championships, Clark also won most of the races he finished, and was often winning or in a podium position if he was forced to retire due to mechanical issues, without which he could have equalled, if not beaten, Fangio's world championship record. Ignoring numbers, if the greatest driver in history for many says you are the best, you have to set aside your opinion and agree. Juan Manuel Fangio himself called Clark the greatest driver ever, and Clark was Ayrton Senna's main source of inspiration to jump behind the wheel. Although drivers since have beaten his records numerically, none have done it in such style or with such ease, despite the stiffest of competition. Jim Clark was a driver unparalleled in his craft, but immovable in his legacy. No bad words could be spoken of him, no enemies happy to see him leave. We can be grateful to have known him, watched him and adored him, to be privileged enough to speak about him, and grateful enough to know what we had: a brave Scotsman, an honourable gentleman, and a champion until the end. We hope you've enjoyed our tribute to one of racing's greatest sons. Having covered Fangio and Senna, we are constantly reminded of just what these men achieved, the legacies they forged, and the impact they have on us all. We have many more to cover, with a foray into rally greats past and present. So be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified of these next videos. And why not share your favourite stories of Jim Clark in the comments below? We're sure there's many more that we haven't told.